Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall. It's such a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's The Dan Schnur Political Report. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Claire Krelitz, our communications manager and digital producer, will be answering and managing your questions during the Q&A portion of tonight's program, which will start in about 30 minutes. Tonight's program is co-promoted by our new forum of California World Affairs Councils, the World Affairs Councils of the Desert, Orange County, Sonoma County, Monterey Bay, and San Diego. This forum was created as an innovative effort to unite California's diverse regions and connect a statewide audience to today's most pressing global issues. The California World Affairs Council's Forum will join again on March 29th for a live stream with Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council of Foreign Relations, for a very imperative conversation about the future of U.S. foreign policy amidst global turbulence. Links to all of these California councils will be provided to you in the chat section in the control panel if you want to learn more about those councils. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur. Dan, we need you more than ever tonight. I think you have over 700 people signed up for today's program, which just shows the urgency of needing your expertise in these crazy times.
Well, that's very kind of you, Kim. And I'm really excited, even though we're doing this once a month now instead of weekly. I still really enjoy the programs and am always really interested and really excited to see the really smart questions that our audience members have to ask at the bottom of the hour when we switch from my presentation to their participation. Kim, it seems like it was only 4 weeks ago that we did a webinar talking about the crisis in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's because it was on February 1st. And you know, just like most of our regular audience members know, that we don't like to do the same topic 2 programs in a row. But I think you'd also agree that it's pretty unavoidable at this point. And so even though we'll be talking about the State of the Union and President Biden's first State of the Union speech, it'll be taking place just after we finish tonight. It was very nice of him to schedule in coordination with us. Just like President Biden's speech, we will spend a lot of our time talking about the crisis in Ukraine because it is first and foremost in terms of world attention. And the balancing act that we have to pull off tonight is not only the same one that the president has to pull off in his speech tonight, but has to do so, at least for the foreseeable future, in every day of his presidency.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to turn this over to you because we need every minute and every second with you. Thank you.
Well, as you know, Kim, this week was supposed to be Joe Biden's reset. This is his first State of the Union address. And the idea was that he was going to use this speech to turn the page from a very difficult first year in office to a much more purposeful focus on the nation's economic challenges. Now, Biden was planning on talking about building infrastructure, about fighting inflation, about rescuing some portion of his Build Back Better social spending and climate change plan, and maybe with a low-key victory lap on COVID-related progress. He's not declaring victory at this point. We learned our lesson last summer, but talking nonetheless about the progress that's been made. And best of all, from the president's perspective, or from the perspective of his political advisors, he'd be able to use this speech to rally a Democratic base that hasn't been that motivated recently by reminding them of the announcement he made just last Friday when he made a history-making nomination of the first Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court in the nation's history. So that was all going to add up to a pretty big and a pretty powerful and a pretty important State of the Union speech for Joe Biden. But instead, Hurricane Putin hit. And I would say that Hurricane Putin hit with the intensity of a Category 5 geopolitical storm. And when the Russian president ordered his nation's troops into Ukraine last week, he not only upset the international world order, of course, this is the largest violence we've seen in Europe since the end of World War II. But Putin also completely overturned the very carefully laid out plans that the White House had been finalizing for Biden's re-coming out party, his State of the Union address to, in all practical purposes, kick off this critical midterm election year. So all those things that I mentioned earlier, the economy and inflation and COVID and Judge Jackson, Biden's going to talk about all those things tonight. But all those other matters are only going to receive a tiny fraction of the public and media attention they would have drawn if the speech had been given only 2 weeks ago. He's still going to lavish praise, of course, on Judge Jackson, who's going to make history, not only for the important demographic breakthrough she represents, but I'd suggest to you she's also going to make history because her confirmation is probably going to attract less news coverage for any nominee to the Supreme Court, probably since the invention of television. Now, the silver lining is the voters who Biden most wants to motivate with this election, voters from minority communities and other progressives, they'll still be energized by Jackson's selection. They just won't hear nearly as much about it, given the tremendous amount of public focus on the war in Eastern Europe. By the same token, similarly, Biden's going to be talking about his economic policy objectives. And there'll be a lot of talk about them on Capitol Hill in the weeks and months ahead. But once again, these plans for fighting inflation, for creating jobs, for building infrastructure, they're not going to get nearly as much attention as they would have otherwise because the American public's attention is going to be focused elsewhere. So that's the challenge for Biden tonight. And we'll talk in just a minute how he's going to balance all these imperatives, talking about all these important issues when the world's attention is focused so specifically on Eastern Europe and on the crisis in Ukraine. So I'm assuming from the way I've set this up that Ukraine can and should be the most important part of his speech. But Rachel, why don't we ask our group what they think? What do you think should be the main focus of Biden's speech? Do you agree that he should be talking primarily about the war between Ukraine and Russia? Do you think he should be focusing on U.S. economic and domestic issues? In other words, we still have raging inflation. We still have a considerable set of economic and other domestic policy challenges. Should that be his top focus tonight? Third, should he be talking about COVID and the pandemic? If we've been discussing this a few months ago, I think we would have all agreed that COVID would and should be the primary focus of the State of the Union speech. Or should he be focusing primarily on the Supreme Court nominee and what Judge Jackson represents and the battle over so many of the issues that the court will be considering in the months and years ahead? Or should it be something else? So Rachel, what did our group have to say? Well, that's interesting. Honestly, that's not as lopsided a vote as I would have suspected. 67%, a full 2/3 of you, do believe he should focus primarily on the Ukraine-Russia war. 31%, a little bit less than a third, say no, it should be on economic and domestic policy issues. And only 1% on COVID and on the Supreme Court. And again, I think we can all agree that had the speech been given in early January rather than early March, these responses would have been much, much different. But assuming that Biden does devote, and he will because there are advanced texts of the president's speech already circulating, and I'll share those with you in just a few minutes. If you assume that Biden does devote a large portion, not all of his speech, maybe not even most of it, but a large portion of his speech to the war, that creates political problems of its own for Biden. Again, keeping in mind that this is such an important midterm election year. because that window for November's elections is rapidly closing. We at this point are roughly 8 months from Election Day, and every day that Americans are watching violence in Ukraine is a day that they're not considering or reconsidering their options in congressional races. The president's poll numbers, the large number of Democratic retirements from Congress, and other contributing factors make this look like a very uphill fight for Democrats to maintain their majorities in Congress. And the less time they have to talk about those, because the public's attention is devoted elsewhere, creates a much, much steeper hill for them to climb. Now, Biden is just beginning, a little bit of a delay, Biden is just beginning to realize some political benefit from the so-called rally round the flag effect that all presidents receive at the beginning of a war. But public opinion polls show that Americans are not very enthusiastic about the US playing a major role in Ukraine. And they become even more divided about it when they're told that such involvement could result in even higher gasoline prices and other forms of inflation. Now, what Vladimir Putin understands is that maintaining political support in a democracy for a prolonged military conflict is not easy. It's generally said that a president is never as popular as he is on the first day of war. And as time passes, voters tend to become more wary. But even if Biden is successful, even if he or the Ukrainians achieve a decisive victory, whatever that decisive victory looks like, that doesn't guarantee political benefits for Biden either. Some of you, like me, may remember the late George H.W. Bush, who, after winning the first Iraq War back in the early 1990s, had an approval rating of 91%. And a year later lost his re-election campaign to Bill Clinton because the voters' attentions had simply turned on to other matters. So I don't want to minimize the real-world impact of the war, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But given that Biden is giving such an important speech in a little bit less than an hour, I think it is important also to look at the political landscape on which this is all taking place. And regardless of how the war ultimately turns out, it probably creates more challenges for Biden and the Democrats in this year's midterms than it does opportunities. Now, all that said, even if Biden would rather not have his speech hijacked by Putin, the first several days of the war are actually shaping up to be going better than expected, to the extent that a war can go better than expected, given the violence and given the tragic loss of life that is taking place on far too great a level in Ukraine. But compared to what had been expected, both in terms of the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and the way that the international coalition that Biden has fashioned is holding together, these aren't things that were necessarily expected even a week ago. I'll admit I wouldn't have expected this type of European solidarity, and certainly wouldn't have expected the extent of the steps that Western European governments have been willing to take to push back against Putin. Olaf Scholz was the new chancellor of Germany, who just took over for Angela Merkel not too long ago. On Sunday afternoon, Scholz reversed more than 75 years of German military policy in less than an hour. And it's been instructive to watch as our other allies in Europe and elsewhere have been much more aggressive on economic sanctions and military assistance for Ukraine than looked likely just last week. Now, watching Biden on this has been interesting because he's been very careful not to take public positions that would have put him out too far in front of where Europe was willing to go with sanctions, with military aid, with the cutoff of the Russian natural gas pipeline into Germany. So Biden's been careful not to get too far out front of the Europeans, but he deserves credit for bringing them along the way he has, much like George Herbert Walker Bush didn't put together that kind of coalition before the first Gulf War. He hasn't been pushing too hard, but getting the West to a much more unified place than certainly Putin had expected was possible. Remember, when we talked about this last month, Putin believed that now was the ideal time for him to strike in Ukraine, given the fractures and divisions in the Western alliance. And in fact, what Putin has found, in fact, is his aggression has managed to bring that coalition back together. Now, to be fair, while Biden does deserve a great amount of credit for the way he's developed this coalition, his critics would also point out that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer was a part of the reason the coalition was so fractured. But let's put that aside for now, and maybe we can get into it in the question and answer a little bit later. And make no mistake, Biden is going to stress this tonight because the public opinion polls just in the last week have shifted immensely in favor of support of Ukraine. And Biden will benefit to some degree from that reflected change in attitude. So I want to quote you just a few sentences from Biden's speech tonight to give you a sense of how he's going to position himself in this debate, and then we'll go on to other aspects of the speech. This is Biden from tonight's State of the Union address. He will say, quote, "Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving, and the costs and threats to America and the world keep rising. That's why the NATO alliance was created to secure peace and stability in Europe after World War II. The United States is a member along with 29 other nations. It matters. American diplomacy matters. Putin's war was premeditated and unprovoked. He rejected efforts at diplomacy. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond, and he thought he could divide us here at home. Putin was wrong. We were ready." Now, what Biden is doing here is, while he recognizes that ultimately he's not going to receive long-term political credit, no matter how positive the outcome ultimately is in Ukraine, if it is something positive, and that's an open question, of course. Essentially what Biden is doing is, just like Afghanistan and the nature of the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan last summer gave voters broader doubts about Biden. This is Biden reasserting himself, not just as it relates to Ukraine and Russia, but more broadly to remind the American voters, many of whom have soured on him over the last 14 months, as to why they elected him to begin with. So will Ukraine matter much in this November's elections? Probably not. Will it matter much in Biden's reelection campaign in 2.5 years? Probably not. But if Biden can use this as an opportunity to reassert himself in front of the American people, then that's a net positive for him in all sorts of ways. Now, as I said a moment ago, not only is there no guarantee that the outcome is going to be a positive one there, despite the heady relative successes of the first several days, but it seems like the next stage of the war is going to be much more difficult. Russia has dramatically escalated its air and missile attacks on Ukraine just over the last day or so. They seem to be in the process, Russian troops, of surrounding the capital city of Kiev. The Russians have learned that Ukraine's military and volunteers are a lot more determined and a lot more resistant than they'd anticipated. But it looks like Putin's generals may now be making adjustments to take that assault to another level altogether. So just in the last day, we've seen Ukrainian President Zelensky asking Biden and Western Europe for more direct military engagement in Ukraine, not just sending weaponry as we have been doing for some time now, but more direct US and Western European military engagement in the form of enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would be a much more aggressive step. So here we sit at this very uncertain but still early place in the war. So another question for the group, Rachel, if we can. What do you think the US role in Ukraine should be at this point? We've seen what's happened over the last several days. We see much greater challenges ahead. How should the US respond? Should we heighten, should we strengthen our economic sanctions against Russia? Should we send additional military support in terms of providing weapons, but not our own troops' involvement? How about both A and B together, both stronger sanctions and additional weaponry? Fourth, what do you think about the prospect of direct military engagement, either in the form of a no-fly zone or some other more direct involvement of US troops? Or fifth and finally, do you think we should simply maintain this current approach? The first several days do seem to have gone better than expected, and maybe this is the path to stay on. So how do we do on this one, Rachel? What did our group have to say? Wow. Look at that. Very interesting. 83%. 83% of you believe that both economic sanctions and additional military support are the way to go. Only 4% say direct US military engagement is a good idea. And only 4% say to maintain the current approach. So we certainly have an appetite among our group for much more aggressive action. But as we can see, with very, very specific limits. More sanctions, more weaponry, but not US soldiers on the ground or in the air. So the sanctions are continuing to strengthen on a daily, maybe an hourly basis. And US and Western military aid to Ukraine is increasing very rapidly also. But the third front, which we didn't mention, is diplomacy. And one of the most interesting diplomatic ploys that I've seen came earlier today from Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. And Blinken called on the UN Human Rights Council to expel Russia, not from the UN altogether, but from the Human Rights Council, arguing that their conduct in Ukraine, not just conducting war, but by the means they've been doing it, is inconsistent with the Human Rights Council's purview. And now, given that so many countries that have historically stayed out of these things are now taking a stand against Russia, countries like Finland and Sweden, countries like Israel, even Russia's longtime Latin American allies like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua have all been criticizing the attack. So on this landscape, some have suggested going even further than Blinken proposed. And the suggestion has arisen that the United States remove Russia from the Security Council, which would, of course, deprive the Russian ambassador of the ability to veto Security Council resolutions, such as those that have been introduced to condemn Russia's aggression. So for many, many years, Russia has used the veto it was given when the UN was first founded in the immediate aftermath of World War II to thwart the majority of the United Nations on all sorts of issues. And now there seems to be at least some sentiment that in this war, or that this war should give the UN cause to rethink Russia's place on the Security Council. What do you think? Rachel, can we? What do you think? Should the United States remove Russia from, should the United States, we don't have that right, of course, should the United Nations remove Russia from the Security Council? Should there be a permanent ban in which Russia is simply removed altogether? Should Russia be temporarily suspended from the Security Council until the war is over? Or third, should we simply continue without any change and continue to push back through all the other means that we've been talking about? And our answer, what did our group have to say, Rachel? Well, that's really interesting too. 66%, 2/3, I will admit once again, a greater number than I would have expected. Roughly 2/3 of our group saying, yeah, let's suspend Russia from the Security Council for now. A quarter, a little bit more, 26%, but roughly a quarter say no, they should be taken off the Security Council now and forever. And only 8% say no change at all. So let's talk a little bit. We talked about diplomatic steps. Let's talk about sanctions, because the sanctions, the economic sanctions that the United States and our allies are imposing on Russia seem to be having a particularly strong impact on Russia's banking and business infrastructure. And of course, that ends up directly impacting Russian citizens ability to buy food and other necessities. But in addition, the personal sanctions against Putin's closest friends seem to be having an impact as well. Because not only are Russia's wealthiest oligarchs having trouble accessing their money, they're also being denied access to private planes, to yachts, to vacation homes, and other luxuries that have many of them publicly questioning the war that Putin is raging. Now, the biggest outstanding question on the sanctions front, in addition to banking, in addition to businesses, in addition to the oligarchs, is whether to broaden the sanctions to include oil and gas interests. And this gets back to the political and inflationary cross pressures with which Biden is dealing that I mentioned earlier. The price of gasoline, not just in the US, but in Western Europe, was already sky high. And while imposing sanctions on Russia's very formidable energy sector would cause much greater economic pain to Russia, it would also cause all sorts of difficulties for the West as well. And that's a gamble that Biden and his allies haven't been able to take yet. One other sanction I want to get your opinion on. Representative Eric Swalwell, the congressman from Northern California from the Bay Area, has now proposed another type of sanction that the Biden administration is not yet considering, at least not publicly. But it's worth talking about for at least for just a minute. What Swalwell is pointing out is just as we are trying, these sanctions are trying to keep Putin's allies from enjoying their access to various luxuries, Swalwell appears to want to target their children. And what Representative Swalwell has suggested, as you can see by the question we've put up, is he believes that Russian students should be removed from US colleges until the war is over. Now, this is an interesting one, and it's certainly going a step further in all sorts of ways. But what do you think? Do you think that's a good idea? Because that would increase pressure on Putin and his closest supporters to an even greater degree? I think no, that's a step too far. We shouldn't be punishing innocent young people. Or we don't usually give you an out like this, but this is a tricky subject. So the third option is simply you can say, don't know. So Rachel, what have we got here from our group? What does everyone think? Okay. Should Russian students be removed from US colleges? This is pretty closely divided. 39%, more than a third, say yes, that this would increase pressure on Putin and his supporters by putting their children in a difficult position. 48%, somewhat higher, but still less than half, say no, that we shouldn't punish innocent young people. And 13%, which could achieve the balance in one direction or the other, simply say, I don't know, Rachel, Claire, you guys ought to be deciding, not us. Now, the biggest wild card going forward on the international stage, of course, is China. And China has become an increasingly strong ally of Russia in recent years, and even in recent weeks. And Chinese President Xi Jinping and Putin have become very close personally. And China was very hesitant to respond to Biden's outreach before the war started. So China's in a difficult position here. On one hand, China loves the idea of the US being distracted from the attention that the US has been devoting to the Pacific Rim. And China might even see this as an opportunity to make a move toward Taiwan, while the US and our allies are preoccupied with Eastern Europe. On the other hand, unlike Russia, China values its role in the world economic markets. That's been the engine of its economic growth. So the Chinese don't like this, the Chinese government doesn't like disruptions. And they certainly don't want to face pushback from reliable trading partners in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere if they're seen as siding too visibly with the Russians during wartime. Now, this is the mirror image of Richard Nixon's outreach to China in the 1970s, and for that matter, to the China-Soviet alliance of the 1950s. But China was obviously a much, much less powerful country then. And of course, in a world with three superpowers, two aligning against the other one whether in the 50s, the 70s, or the 2020s. Two superpowers aligning against the other is a problem for the one, in this case, the United States. So the question is how China balances its marriage of convenience with Russia against the possible impact on their economic interests. And the accompanying question is whether there's anything the US can do to influence Xi's thinking. So Rachel, if we can put up our next question. Once again, we're going to ask your opinion. In this current crisis, should the US change its approach toward China? We've become much more confrontational in recent years under both Democratic and Republican presidents. So what do you think? Should we, given the war now, should we try to improve our relationship with China in order to increase pressure on Russia? Second, should we become more forceful toward China to discourage them becoming more close with Russia? Or third, no change. So what's a better option here? Being somewhat nicer to China? Being somewhat more aggressive to them? Or no change at all? And Rachel, how do we do on this one? What did our group have to say? Wow. That is a much more one-sided answer than I would have guessed. 52%, more than half, say now is a good time for us to improve our relationship with China because that might make it less likely that they would ally with Russia against the United States and our allies. Only 20% say no, now is no time to let up, because of course the argument is if you let up, then perhaps that encourages China to move more forcefully in Taiwan and elsewhere. But only 20% of our group says it's time to toughen up, and 28%, more than a quarter, say that the war shouldn't make a difference. We're on the right trajectory with China. Let's stick to it. So finally, and in just a couple minutes, I'm going to ask Claire to join me, and we'll go to what I think most of you know is my favorite part of the program, to your questions. But finally, because we've spent so much time talking about Russia and Ukraine, we should spend at least a couple of minutes more, even though we started at the top of the hour by talking about the State of the Union. We should spend at least another minute or two talking about the State of the Union speech itself. And I want to make sure that we do have enough time for as many of your questions as possible. So I'll cut this short, and then we can discuss in the last 25 minutes or so. So Biden will be addressing four major areas tonight, and this is something that the White House put out today just to help the news media covering the speech frame their coverage. Four major areas. The first, their description, is the world stage, and obviously on the world stage he will talk about Ukraine, and Biden will say democracy will prevail in Ukraine. So that's the tentpole for his speech. Second, he'll also talk about the economy. He'll talk about lowering costs for working families, in particular talking about a series of anti-inflation measures. Third, he will talk about COVID, and he won't claim victory. But what Biden will say is that the US is, quote, in a new moment, unquote, of the pandemic and has the tools to contain the virus. So maybe not as triumphant as last July, but still a very optimistic look forward when it comes to the pandemic. And fourth, the term that the White House is using for his fourth side of sort of catch-all category is they're calling the future of America. And Biden will point to Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. He'll talk about issues like immigration and climate change. His big ticket bipartisan item that Biden believes he can attract Republican support on also is a major policy initiative on online privacy and online safety for children, heightening protective measures for children using the internet and social media so that they aren't as vulnerable as is currently the case to online predators. Then in addition to that, senior care, the child tax credit, and any number of other domestic policy issues. So that's a lot. The world, the economy, COVID, the future of America. That's a whole lot. And under more normal circumstances, any one of those four broad areas could be the foundation, and a fairly strong one, for a State of the Union address. And so getting all four of those broad areas, those four broad categories into one speech is not going to be easy. But getting all four of those areas into one news cycle is going to be even harder. And so it's safe to assume that three of those four topics while they will all get some attention, the economy, COVID, Judge Jackson, while they'll get some attention, they won't get nearly the amount of attention they would normally deserve, because the war in Ukraine is blocking out the sun and is going to take the overwhelming majority of public and media attention. That's why, once again, what Biden has to say about Ukraine is so important, because it's his opportunity, after all this, to reset with the American people. And in the middle of a world crisis that's caught their attention, demonstrate a level of leadership that, at least in recent months, many American voters have found lacking from him. We'll see if he regains it tonight. But even before that, Claire, if you've got a little bit of time, let's bring in some audience questions. What do you say?
Hi, Dan. I'm just over here sifting through all of the audience questions that we have, and there's a lot. So I've tried to group them into some key categories so that we can consolidate them and maybe hit on a few. So I'll start with the biggest category of questions that we got, and also the most sort of alarming. So a lot of people are wondering your thoughts on whether Putin is bluffing, and would he make any sort of nuclear response, and if you could just talk a little bit about whether you think Putin would use nuclear weapons, and sort of what the U.S. could do to prepare for that reality if you do in fact think it is possible.
Well, Biden was asked that question, and he responded very, very forcefully and very, very briefly, saying that he did not think that that was a possibility. And we should agree that it's unlikely. There has been some speculation from some fairly curious and very highly placed sources, both in the US and in other Western democracies, about Putin's mental stability. And there's been all sorts of conjecture that after 2 years of isolation because of COVID, he might not be as cogent as he once was. And I have no way of knowing whether that's for real or whether that's just trying to troll him. But there is some speculation in that regard. Putin has, as the questioner referenced, at least a couple of times in public statements, made very indirect reference to the use of nuclear weapons. But it's very, very difficult to believe that, particularly for a man who is so consumed with being remembered in history in a certain way, I'm not sure he'd want to be remembered by history in that way. So I don't think you can ever say never when it comes to Vladimir Putin, but it seems relatively unlikely that he would use nuclear weapons, even on a limited basis. One last thing on this before we move on, Claire, is it's been reported just in the last day or two that Biden and the other Western leaders, Macron and Schultz and Johnson, have been talking about providing Putin with some type of off-ramp. In other words, if Russia's fortunes in the war in Ukraine do not improve, giving him some face-saving out so he wouldn't lash out, feeling cornered. Long way of saying I don't know, but it does seem very unlikely.
That is some good news amidst everything else that's going on. So the next question is there a point at which NATO nations would intervene with military might to support a non-NATO nation?
It's very unlikely, and it's for a few reasons. If you listen to Biden over the last couple of weeks, he's been extremely emphatic over and over and over again that he has no interest in sending U.S. troops directly into combat. And in fact, the United States pulled out our military trainers of Ukrainian military personnel before the war started, so that U.S. troops wouldn't be caught in a war zone. Some of that is because Biden recognizes that having U.S. troops directly engaging in Ukraine, leading to direct conflict between Russian and American troops, is an almost certain recipe for a dramatic expansion of the war. And if we do want to avoid not just the prospect of nuclear weapons, but much, much broader warfare, then having troops of both superpowers in that country could very well lead to that. But the other reason, to be more practical about it, is it's incredibly unpopular. You saw, Claire, what our group's poll showed, that as aggressive as our group was for further sanctions and sending more military equipment and weapons to Ukraine, only a tiny percentage wanted to see US troops. And public opinion polling across the country shows that most Americans simply do not see the US's vital interest at stake in Ukraine, certainly not to the degree to deploy troops. So both for political and for military related reasons, I think it's very, very unlikely that we would see US troops in Ukraine. But of course, one of the great concerns of a Russian victory there is that Putin's aggression would continue. And NATO countries like Latvia, like Lithuania, like Estonia, like Poland are probably not countries that American voters would be any more invested in than Ukraine. But the NATO charter commits every single member to committing the defense of every single other member. And just like every other NATO member came to the United States' aid after September 11th, 2001, the US is legally obligated to protect tiny little countries in Eastern Europe that most Americans have never heard of and couldn't find on a map. So US troops in Ukraine, almost certainly not. US troops in Estonia, it's hard to picture, but our country does have a contractual obligation there. So it'd be a much more difficult decision on Biden's part, no question.
So on the topic of Biden and his response, a lot of people in our audience are making the very smart point that this is an opportunity for Biden to step up and gain some favorability as a wartime leader if he handles the situation correctly. So to kind of synthesize some of these various questions on the topic, what do you think that Biden could do right to improve his perception as a competent leader? And maybe what are some things that he could do wrong to have that not be the outcome?
Well, Biden is doing many of the right things now. And I talked a little bit earlier about how adroitly, in my opinion, he's managed to fashion this alliance and has unified NATO to a much greater degree than many people might have thought possible. And he's done that, interestingly enough, not by giving the sort of Reagan-esque Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall type of speech, but through quieter diplomacy, as I mentioned earlier, of the type that George H.W. Bush employed back in the early 1990s. And so keeping an often fractious alliance together is exactly the kind of thing that Biden can be doing in order to improve his stature. How else can he improve his stature? And this is not completely within his control, is win the war. Obviously, the US is not a direct combatant, but the better the outcome ultimately is for Ukraine, the better Biden will look by the time it's all over. If, on the other hand, Russia's recent increase in its aggression does continue and the trajectory of the war turns in the days ahead, and Russia begins to achieve some victories, then Biden, regardless of what he's doing, looks weaker. So what should he be doing? He should continue to be working to strengthen and hold this alliance together in as strong and as ongoing a way as possible. But ultimately, the way that Biden is going to be judged by the war in Ukraine is outside of his control. Because even though the US is playing a very major role, it's not one of the two key combatants, which means ultimately the outcome is going to be decided by people other than him.
So on that note of what Joe Biden is facing, we've had a few people comment on all of the challenges that this president has faced. So I'll summarize some of these by one person's comment that says, "Poor Joe. Can Dan think of any other president who has faced so many world crises in his first year in office?"
Well, he's not the only president to face significant crises. But I would say if you start with the pandemic, you're already separating out his challenges from any that an American president has faced since the 19 teens. Add onto that major economic challenges, add onto that very vexing geopolitical challenges, not just with Russia and China, but with Iran and North Korea and elsewhere. And I think most challenging is the difficulty of still an extremely divided and polarized country. And that's not something he caused, but it's something he inherited. It's something he promised to fix. And whether it's fair to judge him by that or not, it is something he committed to do. So is the president's set of challenges greater than most? It is. Is it absolutely unique? Probably not. But in addition to war and disease and economic challenge, the divisions in our own politics and our own society, I think, is the biggest of those challenges. I think ultimately, if Biden succeeds as president, it's going to be because he finds a way in either the next 3 years or the next 7 years to kind of confront that challenge, even while he's dealing with the more tangible difficulties.
Yeah, thank you. So another topic that a lot of people are asking questions about is whether you have any insights into whether there are people close to Putin who would disagree with him, if there's any internal opposition in Russia who would challenge Putin, and what the challenges of either the people surrounding Putin or the Russian public staging more of an opposition to what's going on.
It's a very good question. It's a really smart question. Putin televised a meeting of his cabinet several days ago. And even in that televised public meeting, a few of his most senior advisors expressed their concerns about a war in Ukraine, about the potential downsides of it. We're already seeing examples of some of the country's leading business leaders, the oligarchs I was talking about earlier, expressing their concerns about the war. We're seeing, albeit for Russia, extremely large protests from Moscow to Siberia and in most decent-sized cities in between. So there's clearly a fairly broad level of, if not outright opposition, certainly of deep concern about whether this is the right thing for Russia to be doing or not. And if Putin did assume that taking Ukraine would be just as easy as taking Crimea 8 years ago, and figuring that he would get a rally around the flag effect from that, that's obviously not happening now. And as the Russian people are finding out, not on state-owned television, but on social media, about the large number of young Russian soldiers who are being killed or captured, that's having an impact on public opinion. Ultimately, though, Putin's cabinet is his appointees. They might voice concern, but probably not in a meaningful way. The people of Russia are just simply not in a position, given his hold over society, to muster the type of uprising that we saw at the end of the Cold War. So to me, if Putin is going to be stopped or even slowed by internal opposition, it's going to be by those oligarchs. It's going to be by the nation's leaders, those billionaires who find their own financial interests suffering as a result of this war. I think it's too early to tell whether the impact on their fortunes is such that they'll turn on him in greater numbers. That's one of the reasons Representative Swalwell is proposing the removal of Russian college students from U.S. universities to up the pressure on that front.
Great, thank you, Dan. So moving on to China now, we have one person saying that one analyst report I read suggested China would use the Ukrainian situation to move forward on the Taiwan situation. And then another person said that the world's reaction to Russia's aggression, would that give pause to China contemplating the invasion of Taiwan? So within these two questions, there is the sort of, both sides of the scale. Would this situation make China more likely to invade Taiwan or less likely? And what are some of your thoughts on that?
Once again, I feel like I'm saying I don't know a lot more this month than I usually do, Claire, but it's for a good reason, because I don't know. But the two questions, I think, very effectively encapsulate the parameters of the current debate over China and Taiwan. As tensions in Ukraine began to increase late last year and early this year, That first question reflected a growing concern in international circles, which is, will China see this as an opportunity to move against Taiwan while a distracted US is dealing with Eastern Europe? But the second question does represent a more recently emerging form of thought, which is, given the worldwide blowback against Russia over Ukraine, China has to ask itself whether it wants the same type of thing. It's entirely possible the Sheikh could decide that the lesson he's learned from Russia is don't go in halfway. Instead of sending in a portion of your troops and only some missiles in air attack, do it quickly and forcefully and immediately, so there isn't time for opposition to build. But I think ultimately what it comes down to, more than anything, is something we talked about a little bit earlier in the first half an hour of the program today. China, unlike Russia today and unlike the Soviet Union during the Cold War, China is not just a military but an economic superpower. And unlike Russia, which is looking for ways to weaken the global economic infrastructure, China is looking for ways to strengthen it and to take it over. And so Chinese economic interests and its very, very heavy reliance on a willing array of trading partners around the world, to me, is the most likely counter to a China attack on Taiwan. And to the second question that you quoted from, the idea that so many countries that normally avoid these types of things, the Finlands, the Swedens, the Cubas, the Nicaraguas, that they're criticizing Russia, that might give China pause, not because Xi doesn't desperately want to reunite Taiwan with mainland China, but because he knows that the country's economic interests are not in a position to be harmed in the way that a worldwide backlash would cause.
Thank you. So the next question will be, could you just share some of your thoughts about Ukraine joining the EU? Do you think this is helpful, effective? Just some of your thoughts on that.
It's more likely that Ukraine would be able to join the EU in the foreseeable future than joining NATO. But one of the reasons that the Ukraine is so far away, even above and beyond Russia's objections to joining NATO, is its democracy simply hasn't progressed to a point where it's met the standards for NATO membership that many other Eastern European countries have achieved. The EU is more achievable, but it's not an immediate thing. It's not a short-term thing. If the European Union were to decide to admit Ukraine in short order, it would be doing so almost in a symbolic way to send a message against Russia. But the process for becoming a European Union member is a pretty long one and a considered one. And just like Ukraine's democracy needs to progress considerably in order to be considered more seriously for NATO, its economic infrastructure needs to strengthen in all sorts of ways before it would, under normal circumstances, be considered for membership to the EU. So it's possible. But if it were to happen, it would be more as a middle finger to Russia than a membership that Ukraine had earned on the EU's traditional merits.
Thank you. This next person asks, do you think it's important to give Putin some sort of off-ramp to end this crisis? And if you do, what sort of off-ramp do you think is realistic here?
I do think it's important. And I talked earlier about how Biden and Johnson and Macron and Schultz have been talking about this, because you can go all the way back to Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, some of the basic strategies of warfare, even from those very, very, very early strategists, is that you always give your opponent a way out. Because the idea being, as both Sun Tzu and Machiavelli stated in very different ways, is, to paraphrase, a cornered animal is a dangerous animal. Because a cornered animal who doesn't see a way out is much more likely to lash out. Or if you give them an exit, that leaves them an opportunity. And in Putin's case, that exit ramp, as it were, would need to be a way not only to allow him to survive politically, but to save some face, both at home and internationally. And that might include a reconsideration of how and where U.S. missiles are deployed in Europe. It could involve some other second or third level geopolitical adjustments but it's clearly not going to include neutrality for Ukraine. It's clearly not going to include a ban on NATO membership for Ukraine. And it's certainly not going to reflect an absolute US pullout from all of the Warsaw Pact states. So leaving those three bright red lines in place, it's on Biden and his allies to come up with an off-ramp that allows Putin to claim even some semi-plausible victory before a home country audience, but without giving in on any of those big ticket items.
Thank you. This next person says, Dan, you asked us about Russian students being removed from US colleges and whether we think this should happen. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on this topic?
I'm really torn on this one too, because on one hand, I really do, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I really do see the oligarchs, I really do see Russia's business leaders and wealthy as the most likely influencers to convince Putin to accept the type of off-ramp we were just talking about. And so I feel like anything that brings discomforts to that ruling wealthy class dramatically increases the likelihood of Putin taking advantage of an off-ramp when it's offered. On the other hand, as most of you know, I'm a college instructor, and I have had Russian students in my class. I have a couple of Ukrainian students in my class this semester. But I would have great difficulty telling a 19 or 20-year-old young man or young woman that they had to leave school and return home because of a war that they obviously had nothing to do with. That said, I understand Representative Swalwell's proposal, and I understand the goal he's trying to achieve. I'd like to think that there's people smarter than me who can come up with other ways to pressure those wealthiest Russians, other than using their children as leverage. But if the war were to turn in a much worse direction than it has over the first several days, I think it's something we'd have to consider. But like I said, I'd hope there'd be other ways to put personal pressure on the kind of individuals who can influence Putin. Ugh, tough question. I like it a lot better when I'm asking them these questions rather than them asking me, Claire.
Yeah, they turned it around on you. So I saved a Trump question for last, but we have had a few sort of around the topic of Republicans insisting that Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if Trump had been reelected. What are your thoughts on this argument?
Well, it's been fascinating that even over the last 10 days, how much more unique Donald Trump's and, say, Tucker Carlson's opinions on this matter have become. A lot of Republicans who even a week ago were siding with Trump and making vaguely pro-Putin noises and asking very derogatory questions about the Ukrainians have decided in the last several days that that's not a safe place to be politically. The safer place for them is to criticize Biden for not being strong enough. And their answer is, Putin didn't invade while Trump was president, therefore he's strong and Biden's weak. Biden supporters' response is, Putin didn't invade Ukraine when Trump was president because he didn't have to. Trump was too busy trying to help him in any number of other ways. I think what this does reflect, more importantly than anything specific about Trump, is a growing divide in the Republican Party over international engagement. From throughout the Cold War era, from the end of World War II until relatively recently, Republicans, as all of you know, generally tended to be much more supportive of international military engagement by the US than Democrats. But it's worth remembering that in a prior era, in the earlier 20th century, Republicans tended to be more isolationist. And the Robert Taft wing of the party that largely disappeared during the Cold War and really didn't reemerge in the 1990s or early 2000s, that isolationist wing did emerge again under Donald Trump and was one of the keys to his political success. There's a very strong isolationist wing in both parties in America today. And Republicans, just like Democrats are split in ways that we don't have time to talk about tonight, the Republican split on this a more traditional Republican militaristic approach versus an even older school Republican isolationist approach is a real fight for the identity of the party. And I don't think we're going to see that debate conclude anytime soon. It's certainly going to keep going long after the Ukraine-Russia war has ended.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan. If this felt like a marathon of questions, it's because each one I asked you was about 5 consolidated in one. So thank you so much. And Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Claire.
Claire, great job. Dan, I know everyone's of your viewers is eager to watch Biden's speech, but I did want to let everyone know you have a number of programs with us coming up, and just give a quick pitch for those because we have so many people asking for more Dan Schnur. On Thursday, March 3rd, we have an inside look at what it means to be the mayor of Los Angeles, and Dan will be interviewing current mayor Eric Garcetti. On March 8th, we have a live stream of the Afghan Women, Hope and Optimism. This is a special program for International Women's Day. And we continue our LA mayoral series with Dan. On March 15th, we will have candidate Mike Feuer. Again, this is at the beautiful Ebell campus in the Mid-Wilshire district. And on May 17th, Dan will be back with candidate Karen Bass. On March 29th, we have the California World Affairs Council series with Richard Haas, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we have the California Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis on March 30th. So please go to our website and sign up today. And for those of you who would like to have more of Dan, we have a special after the session discussion with Dan where our members can ask Dan directly key questions. And we're going to have that tonight following Biden's speech. So Dan,
if I can just really quickly, for those of you who are going to tune in for the after program, if the president's speech goes later than 7 o'clock, we'll wait until he's finished to start our conversation and then go through for 30 minutes from whatever that is. So if he finishes at 7:05, we'll go until 7:35. If he goes till 7:15, we'll go to 7:45. So just feel free to watch the rest of the speech before you rejoin. And Kim, like you, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. And like you, I want to welcome the other members of this new California World Affairs Council coalition. It's really exciting to have them as part of this. And I'm looking forward to doing more programs with them too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. See you in about an hour. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.